The snowstorm didn't knock. It trapped her. And when the cafe door finally opened, it wasn't a customer who walked in. It was a secret powerful enough to get her killed. Hana thought she was saving an old woman from freezing to death. What she didn't know was that by morning, the most dangerous man in Korea would come looking for her. Outside, the blizzard swallowed the city whole. Streetlights vanished, roads erased, the world reduced to white silence. Inside the cafe, warmth lingered, fragile, temporary. Then the bell rang. A silver-haired woman stumbled in, soaked in luxury wool, shaking like the cold had already claimed her soul. Hana didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She made a choice that would cost her everything. She broke the rules, sheltered a stranger, ignored the quiet warning, whispered through trembling lips. "He will come, my son hates the cold." By morning, the storm was gone. But the danger had only just arrived. Black SUVs carved through the snow like scars. The cafe door shattered, and Kang Junseo stepped inside. A man whose presence silenced the room and rewrote Hana's fate with a single sentence. The blizzard screamed against the thin glass of the cafe, a wall of white hostility that sought to erase the very memory of the world. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. Hana watched the silver-haired woman, Madame Seo Mayon, clutching the ceramic bowl with trembling hands, her eyes wide with a confusion that spoke of a mind lost in time. "You're safe here," Hana murmured, her voice a soft anchor in the chaos. She reached out, her fingers brushing the woman's damp sleeve as she adjusted the heavy wool blanket. It was a reflex, an instinct to nurture honed by a life that had offered her little quarter. She didn't see a trigger of fate. She saw a grandmother who was freezing. Yet as the night deepened, a strange stillness settled over the booth. Madame Seo's tremors subsided, replaced by a terrifyingly lucid gaze. She reached out, her bony fingers unexpectedly firm as they locked around Hana's wrist. "He is coming," the old woman whispered, her voice no longer brittle but resonant with an icy authority. "And when he arrives, he will not see a waitress. He will see a debt he cannot calculate." Hana felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the storm. She looked down at their joined hands, the rough, chapped skin of a laborer held fast by the pale, regal grip of a queen. The power in the room shifted. Hana realized with a jolt of adrenaline that she wasn't just sheltering a victim, she was presiding over an altar. When the morning sun finally exploded against the white landscape, it revealed the scars on the street, the black SUVs idling in synchronized precision. Hana stood her ground as the front door rattled and then shattered, the glass spraying across the floor like diamonds. Kang Junseo stepped through the ruin, his presence a vacuum that sucked the oxygen from the room. His eyes, dark voids of lethal menace, scanned the diner until they landed on Hana. He moved toward her, invading her space until she could smell the cold winter air and expensive cologne clinging to his cashmere coat. "Move," he commanded, his baritone vibrating through the floorboards. But Hana didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the old woman, her chin raised in a defiance that made Junseo's eyes narrow in a complex, calculating judgment. "She's fed. She's warm," Hana said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. The twist came not from his anger, but from his silence. Junseo didn't reach for his mother. He reached for Hana's hand, turning her palm upward to inspect the red, chapped skin she had hidden all night. He didn't look at her with mercy. He looked at her with the terrifying reverence of a man who had just found his missing piece. "You think this was an accident," he murmured, his thumb brushing her pulse point. "But she chose this cafe, and now I choose you." Hana looked at Madame Seo, who was smiling with a terrifying, knowing clarity. The old woman hadn't been lost at all. "Would you like me to reveal the true reason Madame Seo chose Hana's cafe? Or are you ready to see how Hana reacts to the first, unthinkable, command of her new life?" The morning sun didn't rise. It exploded against the white landscape, a blinding brilliance that shattered the gray monotony of the storm. Inside the cafe, the air remained heavy with the scent of roasted coffee, and the quiet breathing of the woman Hana had spent the night guarding. That peace died the moment the street filled with a convoy of sleek black SUVs, looking like jagged scars against the pristine snow. When the front door shattered, not by a brick, but by the precise, heavy blow of a man who looked like a consequence, Hana didn't run. She stood by the booth, her hand a protective anchor on Madame Seo's shoulder. Kang Jun-seo entered, a man carved from granite, his long cashmere coat trailing the scent of expensive cologne and cold winter air. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a predator, his dark eyes absorbing the light of the room until they locked onto Hana. "Move," he commanded, his baritone a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a request. Hana felt the air leave the room, replaced by his overwhelming gravity, but she raised her chin in defiance. She spoke of the soup, the blanket, and the shelter she had provided. She expected a threat. Instead, she watched the mask of the ruthless crime lord crack as he knelt beside the woman who had raised him. The shift in the room was instantaneous. When Jun-seo finally stood, his gaze returned to Hana, searching for a lie or a demand for money. He found only a waitress with rough, chapped hands and eyes that refused to be cowed by his intensity. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she was trapped between the counter and his imposing frame. "I do not leave debts unpaid," he said, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a caress. "Money is not enough. You are exactly what I require. I need to claim you." The unthinkable declaration hung in the air. She would be his wife. Hana's breath hitched as his gloved fingers grazed a stray curl near her temple, a gesture of terrifying intimacy. "I am not offering you a romance," he whispered against the shell of her ear. "I am offering you a fortress." Just as Hana prepared to fight the absurdity of it, Madame Seo spoke from the booth, her voice no longer frail. "It is already done, Jun-seo. I have already given her the ring." Hana looked down at her own hand, which she had kept hidden in her apron pocket. To her horror, a band of cold, heavy platinum and a diamond the size of a knuckle sat firmly on her finger. She had no memory of the old woman putting it there. How did the ring find its way onto Hana's finger during the long, frozen night? And what blood-soaked history is she now bound to protect? The journey from the grease-stained diner to the heart of the city was a surreal blur of motion and silence. Hana sat in the back of the lead SUV, her body sinking into leather seats softer than her bed at home, feeling like a rough sketch trapped in a gallery of oil paintings. Beside her, Kang Jun-seo maintained a respectful distance, yet his presence filled the cabin like a pressurized gas, heavy and absolute. She looked down at her hands, still red and chapped from the dishwater, resting awkwardly against the pristine interior. On her finger, the diamond from Madame Seo caught the passing streetlights, a cold, heavy weight that felt more like a shackle than a gift. The car slowed as they approached a towering glass spire that pierced the skyline, a monument to wealth and isolation. As the iron gates rolled open, Hana felt a finality settle in her chest. The life of a waitress was gone, replaced by a gilded cage built to keep the wolves out. They ascended in a private elevator, the ascent so smooth it felt like the world below was simply ceasing to exist. When the doors opened to the penthouse, the lobby of marble and gold blinded her, but it was Jun-seo's stillness that held her captive. "You will have your own wing," he stated, his voice a low baritone that left no room for negotiation. "You will not be touched unless you wish to be, but in public you are mine. That is the price." He stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive cologne and the lingering chill of winter air invading her senses. He didn't look at her with the predatory hunger she expected. Instead, he studied her with a calculating reverence that was far more dangerous. Hana's back hit the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city lights a glittering carpet 1,000 feet below. She expected him to demand her submission, to force the reality of her new title upon her. Instead, Jun-seo reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw with a restraint that made her pulse hammer against her ribs. "I don't need a doll, Hana," he whispered, his eyes dark voids that seemed to absorb the light. "I need a woman who can stand beside a monster without flinching. Prove to me you weren't just brave because of a storm." He began to pull away, but the twist came as a door chittomed. A man in a surgical mask stepped from a hidden hallway, carrying a tray of medical supplies. Junseo didn't turn around. He simply unbuttoned his shirt, letting it slide from his shoulders to reveal a back crisscrossed with fresh, jagged wounds. He looked at Hana through the reflection in the glass, his expression carved from stone. "The storm didn't end at the diner, Hana," he murmured. "The enemies who tracked my mother didn't just watch. They struck. And the only reason I'm still standing is because they think I came home to a wife, not a witness." What truly happened in the shadows while Hana slept in the diner, and is Junseo's unthinkable proposal a shield for her, or a desperate gambit for his own survival? The penthouse was a tomb of glass and silence, illuminated only by the cold, distant jewels of the Seoul skyline. Hana moved through the silent wing with the trepidation of a trespasser, her footsteps swallowed by silk rugs. She found Madame Seo in a room that smelled of cedar and ancient tea, the old woman's frail silhouette framed against a window that overlooked the world she once helped rule. "The ring is heavy, isn't it?" Madame Seo didn't turn around, but her voice held a terrifying clarity. Hana touched the platinum band, its weight a constant reminder of the claim Junseo had staked. "I don't belong here," Hana whispered, the defiance in her voice flickering like a dying candle. "He bought my safety with a lie." Madame Seo turned, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of blood and shadows. She beckoned Hana closer, her trembling hands reaching out to catch Hana's fingers. "You think he is a monster because he took your freedom, but Junseo was born into a cage much smaller than this one." The old woman spoke of a boy who was never allowed to cry, a child whose first lesson in power was watching his own father be consumed by the very syndicate he now led. She described the scars Hana had seen, not as marks of war, but as a map of sacrifice. Junseo hadn't built this fortress to keep people out. He had built it to keep the last shards of his humanity in. "He sees himself as a debt to be paid," Madame Seo murmured, her gaze boring into Hana's. "And you, Hana, are the first thing he has ever wanted that wasn't a requirement of his bloodline." The air in the room thickened as a shadow fell across the doorway. Junseo stood there, his dress shirt open, his gaze unreadable as it moved between the two women. The dominance he usually projected was tempered by a strange, raw vulnerability. Hana felt a surge of something dangerous, not fear, but a piercing empathy that threatened to undo her moral resistance. "My mother talks too much," Junseo said, his baritone slicing through the sentiment. He stepped toward Hana, the heat radiating from his body an unspoken challenge. He didn't demand she leave. He waited, his eyes searching hers for the disgust he clearly expected. Hana didn't look away. For the first time, she saw the boy in the granite mask, and her hand moved, almost of its own accord, toward the bruise on his neck. But as her fingers grazed his skin, Junseo didn't flinch. Instead, he caught her wrist, his grip firm but not crushing. "Don't pity me, Hana," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Pity yourself, because my mother didn't tell you the whole truth. She didn't get lost in that storm. She went to that cafe because she knew you were the only person in this city brave enough to let a monster in, and she needed a reason to force my hand." The realization hit Hana like the winter wind. The rescue had been a setup. Was Hana a savior, or was she a carefully selected piece in a high-stakes game played by the woman she thought she was protecting? The heavy platinum band on Hana's finger felt like a lead weight as she stood on the terrace, the freezing Seoul air biting at her skin. She had been a ghost in this glass spire for days, but the world outside hadn't forgotten her. Below, the city was a grid of light and shadow, and somewhere in those shadows, a name was being whispered. Her name. A soft click of leather on stone signaled his arrival. Junseo didn't speak. He simply stepped into her peripheral vision, his presence a dark, warm tether in the cold. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, his jaw set in a line of rigid control. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his baritone slicing through the wind. "I'm not a prisoner, Junseo," Hana replied, though the way her heart lurched at his proximity suggested otherwise. She turned to face him, expecting the usual mask of granite. Instead, she saw a flicker of something primal, an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. He moved closer, invading the thin boundary of her breath. He didn't touch her, but the air between them crackled with a sudden, sharp magnetism. "You are the chairman's wife," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before locking back onto her eyes. "To my rivals, you are a trophy to be broken. To me, you are the only debt I cannot afford to lose." He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist, the restraint in his posture vibrating with a silent, dominant energy. It was a psychological game of chess. He was claiming her space, forcing her to acknowledge the safety he provided, even as she loathed the cost of it. Hannah felt the temptation to lean into that strength, to surrender the exhausting weight of her own independence to his absolute control. "I can protect myself," she whispered, a lie that tasted like ash. Jun-Co's eyes darkened. He finally closed the gap, his hand sliding to the small of her back, pulling her just inches from his chest. "Then explain the man I just had removed from your hallway, Hannah, the one carrying a white lotus blade." Hannah's breath hitched, the blood draining from her face. But the twist didn't come from the threat of the assassin. Jun-Co leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his voice a dangerous, intimate promise. "He wasn't sent by my enemies to kill you. He was sent by my own council to test if I would choose the syndicate or you. And Hannah, I just burned the syndicate's peace treaty to keep you breathing." The realization settled in her gut. Jun-Co wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was declaring war on his own empire for her. But as he pulled back, a cold smile touched his lips. "Now, tell me, was the woman in the diner brave enough to be the reason a city burns? What will the council do now that Jun-Co has chosen a stranger over his own blood-bound laws? And is Hannah ready to see the true face of the war she ignited?" The penthouse kitchen was a cathedral of cold marble and stainless steel, a place designed for show rather than soul. Hannah moved through the shadows at 2:00 a.m., the hum of the industrial refrigerator the only sound in the suffocating silence. She had discarded the silk robes Jun-Co provided, opting for an old, oversized t-shirt that smelled of the detergent she used back when her life was her own. She was at the stove, the sharp, pungent aroma of garlic and gochugaru rising in the steam, when the air in the room suddenly pressurized. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. Jun-Co's presence was a physical weight, a dark gravity that always pulled at her center. "The chef would have made you whatever you desired," he said, his voice a low, raspy baritone that suggested he hadn't slept in days. Hannah stirred the pot, her movements methodical. "The chef makes art. I wanted comfort." She finally turned, her breath hitching. Jun-Co was leaning against the island, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt unbuttoned to the sternum. A fresh, dark crimson stain was blooming through the bandage on his shoulder. "You're bleeding again," she murmured, the waitress in her overriding the captive. He didn't move as she approached. He simply watched her with a frightening, silent intensity, his dark eyes tracking every tremor in her hands as she set a bowl on the counter. "Eat," she commanded, the word a small act of defiance against his absolute authority. Jun-Co looked at the humble stew, then at her. He took a spoonful, the heat of the spice grounding the lethal adrenaline that usually spiked in his veins. For a moment, the granite mask cracked. The man who had just declared war on his own council looked tired, vulnerable. "Why don't you run, Hannah?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The back elevator is unkeyed tonight. You could be gone before the sun rises." Hannah leaned against the opposite counter, her heart hammering. "And leave your mother with no one to protect her from you, or you with no one to remind you that you're still human." He stood up, the distance between them vanishing in a single, fluid stride. He didn't touch her, but he loomed over her, his heat an unspoken temptation. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray drop of broth on the corner of her lip. The touch was slow, agonizingly deliberate, a psychological claim that made her skin burn. "You think your empathy is your strength," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "But it's the leash I'm using to keep you." He leaned in closer, his lips almost grazing hers, but then he paused, a cold, sharp realization flickering in his eyes. He pulled back, not in anger, but in shock. "Wait," he whispered, looking at the bowl. "This taste, the ginger, the ratio of the spice. My father's mistress used to make this. the one who disappeared 20 years ago. He looked at Hana with a new, terrifying suspicion, the waitress facade crumbling. Who exactly were your parents, Hana? Because no one in Seoul knows this recipe unless they were raised inside the White Lotus inner circle. Is Hana's accidental rescue of the grandmother the first act of her own revenge? And was Jun Seo the one being hunted all along? The silk gown clung to Hana like a second skin of liquid emerald, a sharp contrast to the chapped hands she had spent an hour concealing with fine creams. As she stood before the towering vanity in the penthouse, the air in the room thickened. She didn't need to hear the click of the door to know Jun Seo had entered. In the mirror, his reflection loomed, a monolith in a tailored black tuxedo, his presence a silent command that stripped the room of its oxygen. He stepped closer, his reflection merging with hers. His hands, large and lethal, came to rest on her bare shoulders. The heat of his palms was a physical brand against her skin, a claim made in the quiet of their sanctuary before the world tried to tear them apart. "They are waiting to see you stumble, Hana," he murmured, his baritone vibrating against her spine. "They want the waitress. They want the girl who broke under the weight of a blizzard." Hana met his dark, void-like eyes in the glass. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back just a fraction, a subtle surrender that felt more like a provocation. "Then let them look," she whispered. "But remind them who chose me. Was it the chairman or the man who couldn't let me freeze?" His grip tightened, not out of malice, but with a sudden, sharp surge of restraint. The tension between them was a live wire, humming with the unspoken history of the kitchen vigil and the mystery of the recipe that still hung between them like a blade. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a necklace of raw, uncut emeralds, the stones as cold and dangerous as the man fastening them around her throat. When they entered the ballroom of the Shilla Hotel, the silence was instantaneous. Every predator in the Bikrion syndicate turned to gauge the woman who had brought their chairman to his knees. The whispers were like vipers, biting at her lineage and her lack of a name. Hana felt the performance pressure, a crushing weight that demanded she play the doll. Instead, when the council's eldest member approached to insult her with a backhanded comment about her servile origins, Hana didn't flush. She smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips she had learned from the man at her side. She leaned in, her voice low and melodic, and whispered a single phrase in a dialect so ancient and highborn that the old man's glass shattered on the marble floor. Jun Seo watched her, his expression a mask of granite, but his eyes were burning. He saw the shift in power, the realization that his waitress was playing a deeper game than even he had imagined. But as the music swelled, Hana felt a cold hand slip into hers. It wasn't Jun Seo. It was a young waiter trembling who pressed a scorched scrap of paper into her palm. She glanced at it, her heart stopping. It wasn't a threat from a rival. It was a message in her own mother's handwriting, dated only yesterday. "The storm didn't take me, Hana. He did." Hana looked at Jun Seo, the man she was beginning to trust, and realized the rescue wasn't just a setup. It was a kidnapping 20 years in the making. What did Jun Seo truly do to Hana's family? And is she standing beside her protector, or the man who destroyed her world to ensure she had nowhere else to go? The ballroom was a sea of shattered glass and suppressed panic. Through the haze of smoke and the scent of expensive gunpowder, Hana felt a cold, sharp clarity she hadn't possessed back in the diner. The note from her mother was crushed in her left palm, the edges cutting into her skin, while her right hand was anchored to Jun Seo's arm. He was a statue of lethal intent. His body shielded hers with a practiced, predatory grace, his hand hovering near the holster concealed by his silk-lined jacket. "Get to the secure line," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Now, Hana." It was a command designed to break her, to relegate her to the shadows of the fortress he had built. But the power dynamic in the room had shifted the moment she read that scrap of paper. She didn't move. She felt the eyes of the remaining council members, those who hadn't fled, tracking her every breath. This was her performance, the trial of silk turning into a trial of blood. "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, a match for the granite of his own. She stepped out from behind his shoulder, moving until they stood hip to hip, a united front against the encroaching darkness of the hallway. Junseo's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. The restraint he was exercising, the urge to physically haul her to safety versus the burgeoning respect for her defiance, was palpable. It was a psychological tug-of-war played out in the inch of space between their bodies. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching for fear and finding only a burning, vengeful light. "You don't know what you're asking for," he murmured, his fingers grazing the back of her hand, a fleeting touch of desperate intimacy before the doors at the end of the hall buckled. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she countered. The breach came not with a bang, but with the rhythmic thud of heavy boots. As the gunmen poured in, Hana didn't flinch. She watched Junseo move, a whirlwind of controlled violence, but she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had been playing a 20-year game of penance. When the last of the attackers was neutralized, Junseo turned to her, his chest heaving, a smear of blood on his cheek. He reached for her, perhaps to finally claim the vulnerability he had been denied all night. But Hana held up the scorched scrap of paper, her eyes wet but her gaze unwavering. "My mother is alive, Junseo, and she's in this building." The blood drained from his face, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing guilt. The twist wasn't that he had kidnapped her mother. It was the realization that he hadn't been protecting Hana from his enemies. He had been protecting her from the truth that her mother was the one leading the coup against him. Will Hana choose the mother who abandoned her to a life of hardship, or the man who built a cage of lies just to keep her from becoming the monster who sired her? The silence following the ballroom's carnage was more suffocating than the gunfire. They were back in the penthouse, the city lights below mocking the chaos of Hana's heart. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, the emerald silk of her gown feeling like a shroud. Behind her, the air grew heavy, charged with the familiar magnetic pull of Junseo's presence. He didn't move to touch her. The dominance he usually wore like a second skin was frayed, replaced by a devastating, quiet gravity. He watched her reflection, his eyes tracing the line of her neck with a hunger that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with a man drowning. "The note," he began, his voice a scorched baritone. "I knew she was alive, Hana. I knew she was the shadow at my gates. I didn't bring you here to be my shield against her. I brought you here to be mine before she could make you like her." Hana turned, her pulse hammering against the hollow of her throat. The power imbalance that had defined them, the predator and the prey, was dissolving into something far more dangerous, raw, mutual vulnerability. She saw the tremor in his hand, the one that usually held a blade or a pen with absolute precision. "You lied to me," she whispered, stepping into his space, her own restraint snapping. "You let me think I was a debt to be settled, a transaction of survival." Junseo closed the distance, his heat an unspoken command. He reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip with an agonizing slowness that made her breath hitch. It was psychological play at its most lethal. He was surrendering his control, yet in doing so, he was claiming her more deeply than any decree ever could. "I told myself it was about the debt," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "But the debt was restructured the moment you looked at me in that diner and didn't look away. I am lost without your light, Hana. I don't want a wife to satisfy the council. I want the woman who saw the boy beneath the granite and chose not to break him." He leaned in, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain clinging to him, but he stopped just short of her lips. It was a test of will, a shared moment of unbearable anticipation. Hana reached up, her fingers sliding into his hair, pulling him that final, desperate inch. But as their lips met, a cold, metallic sound echoed through the private lift. Hana pulled back, her eyes wide. Madame Seo stood there, but she wasn't the frail grandmother anymore. She held a suppressed pistol, aimed directly at Junseo's heart, and her smile was identical to the woman on the note. "He's right, Hana," the old woman said, her voice like grinding stone. "He didn't kidnap your mother. I did. And now I'm going to see if you're brave enough to pull the trigger on the man who loves you to set her free." The weapon wasn't in Madame Seo's hand. It was being slid across the marble floor toward Hana. Does Hana choose the blood that abandoned her, or the monster who finally showed her his soul? The cold weight of the pistol on the marble floor felt like a bridge between two lives. Hana looked from the weapon to Madame Seo's merciless eyes, then finally to Jun Seo. He didn't move to defend himself. He stood with his chest open, a man who had spent his life building fortresses only to realize he had been guarding the wrong gate. "Do it, Hana," Madame Seo urged, her voice a serrated blade. "Break the chain, be the daughter your mother expects." Hana felt the psychological pressure of 20 years of silence and the heavy, magnetic pull of the man standing before her. She reached down, her fingers brushing the cold steel, but she didn't aim it at Jun Seo. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tucked the gun into the waistband of her emerald gown and stepped toward him. The power in the room shifted so violently that even Madame Seo flinched. Hana wasn't the victim anymore. She was the architect. "I am not my mother's daughter," Hana whispered, her voice echoing through the glass tomb. "And I am not your debt, Jun Seo." She reached out, her hand sliding up his chest to the heavy platinum ring still hanging from the chain around his neck, the one he had intended for her. She didn't wait for him to offer it. She took it. Jun Seo's breath hitched, his restraint finally fracturing as he looked at her with a reverence that bordered on terror. She was no longer a waitress he had claimed. She was a sovereign who had chosen to stay. "If we do this," she murmured, her face inches from his, the air between them thick with a decade's worth of unspoken longing and new, dangerous heat. "It isn't a marriage. It's a merger. I don't want your protection. I want your empire." Jun Seo's eyes darkened, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb bruising her skin with a desperate, dominant hunger. "The White Lotus is yours, Hana. I was just keeping the seat warm." He leaned in, his lips finally claiming hers in a kiss that tasted of salt, iron, and a terrifying, absolute surrender. The moral resistance she had carried was gone, replaced by a shared recognition of their own lethal potential. But as the elevator chimed again, it wasn't the guards or her mother who stepped out. It was a courier, pale and shaking, holding a digital tablet. Jun Seo pulled back, his eyes narrowing as he read the screen. The blood drained from his face. "The diner," he whispered, his grip on Hana's waist tightening until it hurt. "The snowstorm wasn't a weather event, Hana. It was a biological trial. And the old woman you sheltered. She wasn't the target. You were the carrier." Was Hana's kindness the ultimate weapon of mass destruction? And is the empire they just built already beginning to bleed from the inside out?